Greetings and welcome to our presentation on the buying process. We are pleased you have selected our program to become acquainted with the process involved in buying products and services for your organization. As a purchasing professional, understanding this process will help to ensure the purchasing function is being performed and the steps are being taken to source the needed goods and services for the organization. The buying process can be defined as a process of determining the purchasing needs, selecting the supplier, arriving at a proper price, specifying terms and conditions, issuing the contract or order, and following up to ensure proper delivery and payment. No matter what industry the purchasing professional works in, these processes are generally the steps required to perform the purchasing function. Following these steps will give the purchasing professional the security of knowing the job is getting done properly and will prevent the omission of important steps to take in order to source the proper goods and services for the organization. We will now closely evaluate each step and look at the various tasks that may be involved in getting the buying process accomplished. The first step in the buying process is determining the purchasing needs. This part of the process will differ depending on the industry, the type of products being purchased, and the function of the organization. For example, if the purchasing professional is working in a manufacturing environment that operates on an inventory replenishment system, MRP or ERP, determining the needs may be as simple as running a report that will display inventory shortages and reveal what needs to be ordered. It can also be more complicated, where the sales order has to be loaded, the bills of material needs to be evaluated, and then the needs determined. The purchase orders will be issued based on lead time of the part or parts and the production schedule. On the other hand, if the purchasing professional is working in a custom, make-to-order environment, he or she may need to evaluate the customer's order, the bills of material, or the specifications of the request. Sometimes the buyer has to determine the purchasing needs based strictly on engineering specifications as well. In other situations, the purchasing professional determines the purchasing needs based on inventory levels. In this situation, there may be a predetermined minimum inventory level, and it will be the purchasing professional's responsibility to issue purchase orders to keep inventory above the minimum level. This will be done simultaneously with making sure the maximum inventory levels are not exceeded. Another example of determining purchasing needs is based on customer demands. The needs can be driven by seasonal demand, customer preference, or just improvement in the product, which means customers want a newer model or version. The process needed to determine purchasing needs may differ based on the industry, but this is an important step in the process for all purchasing professionals. Selecting the supplier is the next part of the buying process that signifies to your organization this supplier is the most sufficient supplier to provide the product or service needed by your organization. There may be some situations when the supplier is the only one that is capable of providing the good or service that is needed by your organization. Now, this is rare because we exist in a global market. Sometimes supplier selection happens by sending a request for quote, an RFQ, to multiple potential suppliers. The final selection of who the purchase order will be issued to is determined based on the quote the supplier submits as a response to the request. There are times when the supplier is selected because of their ability to support the needs of the purchasing organization. For example, the supplier may be able to hold inventory for the purchasing organization, or restocking the inventory at the purchaser's site. In some industries, the supplier selection process entails taking the supplier through various steps to qualify that the supplier can support the purchasing organization's needs. This qualification can include visiting the supplier's facility, a verification that the supplier has the tools and resources to support the purchasing organization's needs, or requiring the supplier to complete a questionnaire pertaining to the ability to support the purchasing organization's needs. In some instances, if the supplier does not have an established relationship with the purchasing organization, the selection process is more detailed and requires more information from the supplying organization. The next step in the buying process is arriving at a proper price. At this point, the purchasing professional has to understand what the competitive price is for the item or items being purchased. Strong negotiation skills are also important during this phase of the buying process. Although negotiation may sound simple, like discussing the concerns until an agreement is made between two parties, it is much more involved. There are many techniques involved in negotiating the proper price to pay for the item or items being purchased. As a purchasing professional, you must understand the cost of the product. This cost is not what you will pay, but what the supplier has invested in the product to get it produced and delivered to you. If there is a clear understanding of what is required to get the product manufactured, then the purchasing professional can determine if the price the supplier is quoting is fair and competitive. Part of the buying process that becomes a part of the contract between the buyer and the supplier is established terms and conditions. The terms and conditions inform the supplier when they will receive payment for the product they have sold to the purchasing organization. The most common terms and conditions are net 15, net 30, and net 45. Sometimes a supplier will offer a discount if the invoice is paid early. For example, 1% 10, net 30 means a 1% discount will be taken if the invoice is paid within 10 days of invoice date. Once again, please review the presentation on payment terms for a more in-depth look at this topic. Conditions include any special requirements or instructions that need to be conveyed to the supplier by the purchaser. These conditions become a part of the purchase order, the contract. The supplier adheres to the conditions, and the receiving department, purchasing organization, must make sure that these conditions are met before they accept the part. The next step is to issue the purchase order. The purchase order is the legal contract between the buying organization and the selling organization. Therefore, the purchase order has to be clearly stated what is being purchased and the conditions under which they are going to be purchased. The purchase order should contain the name and ship to address of the purchasing company, and the name and the remit to address of the supplier. The date of the purchase order must be included. The terms, date parts are expected to be received, and shipping information should be on the purchase order. Also important to be included on the PO is what is being purchased, the quantity purchased, and the unit being purchased, such as each case or box. And in addition, the agreed upon price of the item being purchased. Any instructions or special information should be included on the purchase order. The purchase order should be signed by the authorized purchasing agent. If the order is sent electronically, the purchaser's name should appear on the purchase order, and this will suffice as a signature on the purchase order. There are situations where there will need to be attachments to the purchase order. Additional specifications or engineering drawings sometimes need to be submitted with the purchase order. In a situation such as this, there should be a note on the purchase order stating the part should be manufactured to the attached drawing or specifications. If a drawing is attached, the drawing number and revision level should be noted on the purchase order as well. Once a purchase order is received and accepted by the supplying company, the purchasing professional should periodically check with the supplier on the status of the parts to make sure that they will be delivered on time. Once the parts are delivered to and accepted by the purchasing organization, the buyer should follow up internally to ensure payment for the goods is made within the agreed upon terms. Sometimes, the purchasing professional will have access to this information electronically and can check on the status in the system. Checking the status of the payment is very important if it is a new supplier. If the purchasing professional is trying to establish a new relationship with a supplier, he or she wants to make sure that the payment is sent within the agreed upon terms of the purchase order. The buying process is an important part of the purchasing professional's responsibility. Following the stages discussed in this presentation can help ensure the purchasing function is being performed correctly and all necessary bases are being covered. The buying process should be considered as a tool that helps a purchasing manager expert to be successful in the required tasks of buying product to support the organization's functions. Thank you once again for your time and attention, and this is businesstraining.com, where you can earn a master's level qualification to make more money.